That's a gigantic gun safe. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, meet Micah Albert. Micah and I have known each other for a long time, going back to college. Both of us have had a career in the nonprofit space and in social impact. Micah is a phenomenal journalist, spent some time in the nonprofit world. Micah, welcome. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Good to see you, Javin. It has been a very long time. I think
Embarrassingly so.
I've got a little more gray hair, but
I doubt it.
who's keeping score?
I doubt it.
Yeah. So, like you said, spent a lot of time in the nonprofit sector. Photography and photojournalism has kind of always been the baseline for me. But kind of as you do the work and as you travel and you see what's going on the ground, half the time you come across nonprofits that you've never heard of, and you find yourself in a position to be able to contribute or really align kind of with what they're doing on the ground, on the grassroots level. And it's kind of impossible to not want to be connected to some of the mission on some of these groups as you're working in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. And to give some context, right? When I say journalism, you're going to about as dangerous of places as you can go. So we're not talking about, journalism of, small community problems. And again, not to
Right.
take away from any issue. There's a ton of issues out in the world and they're all important, but you're talking about going to Yemen. You're talking about documenting some of the most volatile areas in the world, and recognizing, hey, who's on the ground here? Who's doing amazing work? I know we initially synced up and worked with Empowering Lives, which was an amazing organization doing work overseas. So I love that. I love that you're there, you're on the ground, you're meeting the people who are doing the work, which oftentimes is hard to find, right? You have a lot of organizations that are doing a lot of fundraising, but not always getting all of that to the places where the money needs to go. And so I appreciate that angle of saying, like, look, I'm boots on the ground, I'm seeing the stories, and then I'm looking at the organizations that are there. And I'd love to spend a little time talking about that idea of capturing a story, telling a good story. Like, you put your life on the line multiple times to do that. I'd love to just talk a bit about what your journalism trips are like. Just kind of paint that picture, like what it takes and the kind of opportunity cost or just the cost in general of really capturing stories in places like that.
Yeah. I mean, the way I kind of describe it is that there's kind of two sides to it, right? I mean, it's if you're going independent and you're working with a major news outlet. I did a lot of work with Foreign Policy Magazine and a lot of major outlets like that. Or if you're going and or connected or 50-50 with a nonprofit and you're kind of independent or at the news organization, it requires tremendous amount of legwork before you ever get on the ground, right? I mean, it's making the connections, it's full-time networking, learning how to pitch ideas to editors in big cities, and becoming essentially an expert on a topic before you kind of even get there. And also understanding what are the media needs at the moment. It can be a little bit crass, but I've pitched a lot of stories in sub-Saharan Africa, and that was kind of the backbone of my career was covering underreported issues. So, you've got to be able to bring people up to speed really fast, both editors and the public. And so sometimes the natural kind of pathway to do that was through, or in terms of the audience, was a nonprofit already connected on the ground through their audience. Sometimes it was massive, complex, multi-year process of getting intel on the ground from stateside, developing connections and networks through various UN agencies that might have a little bit of an in a kind of a denied access area, and figuring out logistics. I mean, so most of these on the larger projects, on the more difficult to access places, it was about a year long effort before I ever even got on a plane to go anywhere. So that's like part one. Part two is kind of, all right, now you've done all this difficult work. You've laid the groundwork. Now you actually have to show up and do the job, right? And like you say, some of these places are a little bit dicey or a lot dicey, and uh, you've got to keep pushing through no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And no matter how you feel, you've got to go kind of upstream with whatever is going on the ground. It takes a lot of time to get halfway decent at it. I don't feel like I've arrived in any way, shape, or form. I've got a lot of friends, obviously, and colleagues in the industry, and they do circles around me. But everybody kind of has their own way of doing it, their own kind of passion and interests and topics, and kind of where those overlays with a map on the planet, and you end up finding, where you work well, what communities you work in, what part of the world kind of makes you tick. And, in the end, you've got to be able to come back and, you got to have something to show. You've got to deliver.
Yeah.
And it's difficult work. It's
Yeah.
difficult work in the field, and it's difficult work to make the case, even to the nonprofit world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think there's a couple of things here, because as I'm trying to think through how does this become valuable to people who listen in, like,
Right.
I want to touch in on the idea of like what it actually takes to capture story. We talk a lot, 50 is a branding agency, Donate Lee's doing, fundraising. You need those stories to show people what it is you're doing. But oftentimes people don't think about the toll it takes on individuals or the cost to go and capture those stories, right? And if it's a good cause, it's going to be dangerous places, right? It's going to be places where people are, it doesn't always have to be dangerous. I should back a little bit on there, but oftentimes it is, right? And if the story is hard to capture in dangerous places, we need it all the more to illuminate what's happening, right? You think back to Invisible Children, you think to the stories that were happening in Uganda and Sudan, and I know you were in Yemen, and to the degree, right? We've had drinks and talked, and I mean, you've been pulled out of cars, you've been you've been escorted out of countries at gunpoint. Like, that is the reality of what it takes for an organization to tell their story. And I think a lot of times organizations recognize, like, that's too risky. That's not something we should be putting people in the line of fire like that. But it's so valuable to the nonprofits to get that back. And I've seen your work, I've seen the journalism, I've seen the photos. Like, as a marketer, to have that stuff, it changes the game, right? When we're getting assets from an organization, it's like, oh, we do these things. You go, okay, cool. Show me pictures. That's a great story. Do you have any photos of that person? Do you have any photos of that village? Do you have anything at all? And you get stuff from 5 years ago. You get something off of an iPhone. And you go, look, like, this is a world that is hyper sensitized, hyper distracted. They're on TikTok, they're on Reels, they want video, and we've evolved a lot in the digital space. If you come at them with an email newsletter that doesn't have that type of delivery, it's really hard to get people to care. So I see kind of both sides of it. I see the risk, but I see the need. And I think you have the most skin in the game, because you're the one they call when it's like, hey, look, we need to capture what's going on here. And they get somebody like you involved. So, we talked a bit too before doing this. Some of this was for photojournalists and for students and for people who are going to want to get into this. And I love the idea that somebody's watching this and thinking, like, this is where I want to spend my time. I want to be professional, but I want to report on things that are ethically defensible. And I feel like we need to put that out there, that, like, a lot of this is dangerous, right? And a lot of it is putting yourself on the line. But what you get back is absolutely necessary, and it empowers the missions that are out there doing the hardest work.
Yeah. And again, it's not all dangerous, right? I mean, I don't want to paint a picture that it's all chaotic. I mean, a lot of these places are just fine, and there's a lot of amazing things going on. But I think what I found in the field is that there's there some of these spaces, the amount of overlap in the nonprofit sector on the ground of organizations doing identical things with similar missions in the same communities, barely aware of each other, and you multiply that by, by a lot. There's dozens of things going on. The environment is target rich for, I would say, a younger person to get involved in the industry, and it's extremely safe. I think the challenge is the ability for younger people to communicate to nonprofits, and for nonprofits to, especially boards, to better understand essentially what you just said, the value of high quality content um, has always been a difficult sell. So then you kind of move forward into that, into maybe an adjacent country or adjacent region, maybe times two adjacent. And that was some of my pathway, was like, I'd go to a place in East Africa and I'm like, my gosh, like there's a lot of folks here that could do this job. There's folks already in the organization. We could do a little bit of training. There's plenty of opportunity to help educate the local voice and local perspective to do what I do, to help communicate both in words and images, video, whatever, to basically help them better understand the Western audience, if this, again, is for a nonprofit. So there's a lot of opportunity there in some of the well-worn path locations. And I think it's a lot more, it's a lot different going into, it's an entirely different conversation going into the very dangerous places.
Yeah.
And I would also say that, just to kind of piggyback on what you're talking about, the thing that I've been really driven by is helping people understand context. And this is whether this is like a massive project in southern Algeria that I worked on embedding with the Algerian counterterrorism special forces patrolling the southern border along Mali. This is a hotbed region, especially during the peak of the war in Libya. Al Qaeda in North Africa was basically preying on young kids in these refugee camps and trying to recruit them across the border into Yemen, or excuse me, Libya. And that's a very different thing. That's something, let's say, for example, in Kenya, right? So this is, in that particular example, there's a lot going on that people do not understand. That's obvious, but to explain the context of that, what's at stake, right? So that's something that I've been really driven by, especially with this audience, is a lot of nonprofits, immediately jump to the end game, to the happy smiles, to the completed building, to the completed well. But especially founders, people that have been in their sector for such a long time, it's difficult for them to see the forest through the trees because they've been in it so long. So they don't. It's tough to really explain the value, I would say, as a storyteller, of context, of why does this matter, and where, again, what's at stake, what's the before and what's the after. There's a lot of after photos.
Yeah. After photos are a lot easier to capture, I think. The story's done, the person went through something, but here they are, and we can do an easy smile and an easy photo shoot. I think that's accurate. We're doing some cancer work right now in the kind of rebranding of an organization around children's cancer. And that's where a lot of people go, is let's show the success stories. But what we're missing is that childhood cancer is nowhere near as progressed as adult cancer, because it's much harder to research. It's much harder to do clinical trials, but we just don't want to see kids going through that. But that's the problem, is now we haven't given it context, and we haven't really helped people realize that most of these childhood cancers are still a really rough road, and treatment's a really rough road because of that, because we haven't really captured it and been willing to get out there and tell that story in a way that's, you don't want to stay there. I definitely am a proponent for showing that and showing hope and showing that we can do something about issues. But if you don't ground it in a setting that is in need of dire support, it's a tricky kind of narrative to tell, right? So the context needs to cover kind of all the elements of that story.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. I mean, there's a well-established, well-known photojournalist that's been connected to the Sacramento Bee for a very long time. And she essentially did a very long-term story on childhood cancer years ago and the journey of that. I mean, it ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize because it's heart-wrenching. It's beautiful work, but it's the essence of the context. And I just would love to see those two connecting in the nonprofit world, and the stuff that's winning Pulitzer Prizes and the nonprofit world. They need to work together more. They need to see the value in that.
I feel like the way you did your work is relatively unique in that, as a journalist, I don't know how you funded all those trips, but they typically weren't, oh, I got hired by a nonprofit, I'm going to go over and do just this photo shoot of a couple stories and come back. Like, you're talking the planning, the execution of all the travel, the equipment, like to go. It was almost like you had a theme of like a region and a handful of topics, and you could cover more. Like, what I'm trying to figure out, and we'll get to kind of this idea of, it's going to sound like a big leap, that idea of artificial intelligence, of like how much stuff is now being crafted rather than being captured in the field, right? There's a way to start to try to do this in a less genuine, more cost-effective way. But what you're saying is a great medium where it's, as a journalist, you can get out there, you can capture this stuff and kind of have a handful of hands in the pot around who could potentially buy those photos, who you could potentially work with. And I like that. So I don't know if there's like a model here, but I know when we were doing stuff with Invisible Children and World Vision, a handful of organizations, it was like, we just don't have the resources to spend 20 grand on a photo shoot. Is there a better way? Like, have you found something that people could repeat, either for nonprofits or journalists, that becomes a way in which that becomes higher value, less expensive? Like, is there some system for how you did it that we could teach people?
Yeah, I mean, it is I've worked with you enough and other nonprofits to kind of understand what the communication pipelines, what the actual content needs to look like, and how frequent that needs to have, and what's the shelf life of that, and where said imagery needs to essentially live, right? Depending on how it's going out to the public. So there's a wide range of types of images. You're right. The logistics are, I can't even, it's such a daunting thing. And then I understand young people. It's like, where do you even begin with that? And it's, so it depends on the region, right? But
Yeah.
I do know that the model that I like seeing, and this doesn't exactly answer your question, but something that I'm very interested in, is having stories be told by people that don't necessarily look like me, and images taken that don't necessarily take somebody from the West Coast.
Yeah.
To spend that kind of money, right? But it is expensive. The logistics are expensive. And so the resources to put into basically local talent, I think you can focus some of that money and investment into, the local ability to do that. And I see this happening in World Press Photo in their community. There's a lot of master classes that they're spearheading in sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of different regions in the world, so that the photojournalism community isn't just represent, everybody flying to the Netherlands every
Yeah.
year to, celebrate all of our accomplishments. It's when you go to these things, it's pretty one-sided. So I think a lot of that investment could go into local talent, and again, the education of who and what the audience is, what they're looking for, what's interesting. That's I feel like that I'm not seeing enough of that.
Yeah.
I'm seeing more of that in the journalism community more than the nonprofit sector, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, what I'm seeing is a lot of organizations. I probably worked with 3 or 4 larger organizations this year attempting to decouple the concept of um, having like a US central office and then these local country offices. Like the whole dynamic of that feels off to them. And it's becoming much more of a like, spread your wings, become your own entity, become an NGO or an NPO on the ground there, have your own board, have your own staff. Like, I think based on a lot of that same thing, which is culturally, we just don't want to. We've realized it's not about seeing it. It's not, it is a bit of the optics, but underneath the optics is that that's not necessarily the best solution, is to have another country come in and try to solve problems for another country. It's not sustainable. The model there is broken. And so what we're seeing is, and this is a good example of that, right? Even the journalism, even the storytelling, like what story you and I would craft, it's probably not as authentic as the person who's there, right? So how do we change the way we've done things for a long time to shift how the businesses look, to shift how the stories are told, to shift who's making the decisions? Like, it's a pretty cool thing, I think, holistically, to recognize rather than doing it from here, we can assist in getting an organization on the ground, capacity building. I'm trying to put a sentence on capacity building, right? But they can
Mm-hmm.
do all that on their own. They just call us when they need any help. But in essence, we help them with the resources we have to get their own entity up and running. And in
Mm-hmm.
that entity is journalism, is storytelling, is photography, like less and less of a need to lean on that parent organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That feels like a trend that's happening more and more. And I love that because
Yeah. Me
again, it's
too.
just, I feel it's humbling, but also it feels a bit disingenuous. It's like, hey, you have to tell that story. It's like, well, I'm sitting in my house in San Diego. Like, that's a really hard thing for me to like close my eyes and envision that visual and that
Mm-hmm.
story and that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So much of that can be done from a brand perspective. If it can on the ground, I think that's way, way better. Right.
Yeah, and I don't know if you wanted me to touch on this at all, but how are some of those things funded and all of that? But it's there's a handful of trips that I did in Chad and other places, but I did a lot of work with World Food Program and UNICEF and UNHCR and UN. The UN will flat out they've got budget for that,
Mm.
and they also clearly see the value in investing in that, and so
Yeah.
that is something I have seen. Those take more work. There's obviously more bureaucracy than a grassroots organization
Sure.
that you have to spend more time kind of pitching why this is important.
Yeah.
But I would say that over time it's a lot of work to pitch. It's a lot of work to kind of hustle why this matters.
Yeah.
It did, and it has gotten frustrating over the years to constantly have that same approach. It can be discouraging. It has been discouraging to do that in the nonprofit world.
Yeah.
To boards, like having to explain why this matters. It's tough. It's tough, and so there, I would say there's times I've ebbed in and ebbed out of working in the nonprofit world, and oftentimes working not in the nonprofit world because in the major publications they understand why this matters, and I don't have to constantly sell that to them.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Let me
feels
just
like
do this work.
there's the independent angle, right? Where you go take your photos and get paid after. It's like making a music album, right? Like you just hope that people are going to love it and you're going to get paid back for that
Yeah,
effort.
I've
And
never done that. I've never used that model.
yeah.
These
Well,
trips are too expensive on the front end. Like I've always needed assurances and
yeah,
a lot of irons in the fire, going into a trip. But
yeah, yeah. And in my head, like I deal with the same things in the digital world, right? Is like what our clients want. So many of them want similar things. So it's like I don't want to reinvent the wheel with every single project. So how do you build efficiencies into what you're doing? So it's like, hey, look, we can drive that cost down because we've got either a handful of other people paying for the same thing, or we've built a
yeah,
framework by which we're never starting from ground zero. And I love the idea that there's a framework for photographers and photojournalists and journalists to say, hey, here's a trip I'm taking. Here are the potential. I think back to Pulitzer Center, who we work with now, which is awesome. Like they could be funding some stuff. The UN could be funding some stuff. There's boots on the ground. There's organizations on the ground. Like, how do I get out there and tell a handful of stories? Because you can't just show up and capture random stuff either. It has to be contextual. It has to be, there's so much to that orchestra in order to make a trip like that create as much value for as many organizations as possible. You wouldn't even think of it, right? And that's an interesting part of the
yeah,
puzzle that has to be figured out. Otherwise, like you feel like so many journalists are starving artists, right? And that's a hard space to be in where you have to make money out of it, right? Or make
yeah.
a
I
living.
I would say that the really successful photojournalists out there, by default, they've learned how to have a lot of irons in the fire on everything. They know how to leverage every day on the ground.
Yeah.
And so the one thing I wanted to comment on is the best work I've produced is when I'm truly independent. And I might have a connection with the nonprofit, but I'm not necessarily getting hosted by the nonprofit. Having a separation, a genuine, as unbiased as possible separation from the nonprofit to do objective work, to show the context, to show what's happening in a community, has always produced some of the best work I've ever done. And the kind of byproduct of that is just let the photographer be, let the journalist be, let them do their work, let them discover the impact,
Yeah.
plus or minus one way or the other. Let that play out has always produced the best work in terms of journalism and the ethics around that. And the byproduct is if it's connected to a nonprofit or it's connected to a community that a nonprofit happens to be working in, there's a lot to be gleaned there.
Yeah. I think that came up a bit when I talked to Marcus Price, you may or may not have worked with him a bit when we were doing Invisible Children stuff or early years with 50. His creative process, I think, was he appreciated that idea too. Of like his best work was when he was like left alone, right? He credited this idea of like you let me have time to just come up with things and be creative. And I think the less forced content or forced direction you get, you have that ability to like look for those aha moments and those creative moments and like chase them to wherever they need to go. Which is interesting. We'll come back to that when we talk about AI because it's there's something similar to that too. You can't lean into AI and try to tell it to do exactly what you want to do. You got to do the same thing, like see what's working within it and like chase it where it needs to go. But you can't tell it where to go as well as you want to. I'm sure in the next iterations probably will get better and better with that.
Sure.
But that idea of like allowing a story to go where the creativity leads it is phenomenal. My question though is who pays for it then? Because that sounds ideal, right? To any nonprofit owner or whatever, it's like, oh yeah, just let your creatives go be creative. Well, that can get expensive because who knows how long it takes. Or what if they come back with something that doesn't work? Like there's a rub there where you want to go, no, I need you to do this by Friday. I need a comp for this. And that's exactly what I need, or a photo shoot of the following things. So it seems hard to give them that freedom. And then secondarily, if you're kind of just not tied to that organization, then where is that funding coming from to kind of just let you go be creative like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's an exact playbook, but I mean, I think that is some of the hard work as a photojournalist is figuring that out, right? And I guess, I mean, maybe the easy answer is figuring out who's able to pay essentially a day rate for you and just let you be, maybe give you access to one of their Land Cruisers and if you don't speak the local language, maybe maybe somebody that could come along with you, but
Yeah.
the more hands off, the better. It's in terms of from a nonprofit perspective. So yeah, I agree. It's not an easy answer to how to solve that as an individual. I mean, that's another conversation. That's a workshop for me and younger folks of how to navigate that when they're getting started.
Hmm.
It's a conversation amongst seasoned veterans, so it's a bigger conversation.
Fair enough. Well, I love too that you have perspective and experience sitting within the walls of the nonprofit organization as well, not as just a photojournalist and storyteller. So I'd love to kind of hear a little bit about maybe that perspective. Like, what did you learn? What did you recognize kind of on that push and pull of like being that person, but also being um, employed by a nonprofit and recognizing like, yeah, sometimes that's not something we can put money into, or sometimes there's other priorities, right? How did you balance that? What did you see there as maybe a unique perspective?
Well, that's I would say being on as the closer you are to that sector, whether you're in the building as an employee or at least you're at the conversation. I mean, when my wife and I were living in the Baltimore, DC area, just the proximity to DC and having like weekly conversations with stakeholders and gatekeepers and kind of understanding what's going on globally before it makes headlines is always really helpful. So I would say the closer you are to those conversations, the more you can glean, the more you can kind of like foresee what is the next big thing we should probably be covering globally. You know, uh, you kind of always have to be thinking a year, 2, 3 years out. What's the next big thing? How are we going to tell the story? How are we going to get access? What's the angle? And I would say, again, the best work that I've done is when I feel like I have the most freedom, and sometimes when you're directly connected or employed by a nonprofit. Again, the default from higher ups and management seems to, want to go to the happy faces and the results of a project of a certain investment laid years ago. It's not maybe the nicest answer, but it's a tough answer.
Hmm.
It's a necessity at times, but I just would say that again, the best work is done when you can be as independent. This is back to ethics and journalism. It's just tell the story. Like, is there actually impact? And I think
Yeah.
some of the nonprofits, some of the maybe the smaller ones, could be a little bit self-conscious of what story some rando journalist coming in might tell. There is apprehension around that, for sure, apprehension and insecurity around that. And I think those that have a lot of confidence in their programs and in the policies that they're implementing seem to want to be less hands off and like, yeah, go check it out. We're doing amazing work. Go see for yourself.
Yeah, I can see that being tricky, right? Being a business owner and just handing the keys over to somebody else to decide what comes back, right? Like you want to allow for that freedom, but oftentimes I could see that being a challenge, and trying to balance that with business needs, right? Like you're sitting in a room where you're trying to decide on how to move business objectives and goals and KPIs. And oftentimes you jump to the solution more than you do the challenge, right? So I could see myself being in that seat saying,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we need our donors need to see the impact of the work being done on the
Right.
ground. And they go, great, let's send a journalist out there. Let's take pictures of the success stories. And you start to answer. And the hard part for me is delegation, right? Delegating what you have an employee for or you have a resource for to let them do their job versus dictating, here's what I want you to do, right? And the best scenario, like you said, is, hey, here's the challenge that we have, and I want you to come up with a way to solve it, right? Our donors, our supporters, our board, we need to see evidence of what's being done, but like take it at that. Give as little guidance, little, and especially when it comes to creative direction, as little creative direction as you can muster is probably better if you're hiring the right person and you like the work that they've done. Then at that point, get out of the way. And I would say, as a creative, that is the hardest part when it's like, I got this great idea, and they're like, no, like this is. We really love this site. We really love this style of imagery. Can you just like recreate that? And it's like, well, I can get pretty close, but I think the end result's going to be a lot better if you just let me start to think of what pieces are the right inspiration and the right elements, and let me run as a creative off of my own thoughts and ideas. That's just like you said, it's going to be better. You need that freedom to run and explore and pin things and scribble things and come up with it versus being tasked with recreating somebody else's work, right?
Yeah, I've always applauded the work of Doctors Without Borders, especially when it comes to their partnership with the Seven Photo Agency and working with some of the most elite photographers on the planet, because they are extremely effective at communicating the context of what's going on the ground, and most of these places are extremely dangerous places to work for their staff, and it's they do a really good job of allowing creative freedom of hiring, so what I hear is like, hiring the right creative and getting the right talent, and also allowing them to do their work and, hands off. And they're them as an example, they seem to have confidence in their work.
I'm curious. I know we want to end with some ideas for some kind of like insights and stuff for both, younger people, photojournalists, journalists, people trying to get into the space. I also want to kind of end with some ideas for organizations. But before we get there, I kind of do want to touch on the AI side of things, right? Because so many of the conversations I'm having right now are finally legitimizing getting to a place where not just AI as like a text-based or data manipulation tool, but actually as a creative tool has really come a long ways. And we're getting to a place where, like we said before, if you walk into that as a creative tool and you use it to explore versus, hey, I need it to be this very specific thing. I've seen some very creative executions, even if it's inspired by, I saw some work done that was based off of a photographer who was in Kuwait, and like, how do we expand on his style and his war coverage? And you can get so contextual that we can start to emulate a lot of this stuff, and at least create, at bare minimum, what we can do is create visually stunning, topical, realistic images, and even base them off of real stories, real events. And we can even base them off of real photos. We can have a photograph turned into a bunch of B-roll footage that's, if not already today, unnoticeable within the next year. And I'm starting to ask the ethical question, right? And I love that you're a journalist, because you are the person who's saying, like, we don't fake this stuff. Like, we go to the ground and we take real photos of real people. Pulitzer's in the same boat. Like, there's no, like, we're not going to AI generate photography, but artists or people who are doing brand work who go, hey, look, if you don't have that $20,000 in a day, we can start to craft some of this stuff that emulates what that would have done. I'm sure you've thought about it a bit. I don't want to leave it this open-ended, but like, what are your initial thoughts on where that's going and kind of the ethics of kind of starting to extend journalism with this type of technology?
Yeah, it's I guess it's tough to have a lot of answers on this at the moment, other than that ethically I see it as a slippery slope. Ethically, inside I have no problem with, like you say, B-roll, buried down somewhere on the website, something to communicate X. Doesn't seem to be a problem. So like when I look at it in its parts, other than like hardcore journalism or journalism period, that needs to be separate and
Yeah.
its credibility intact. But if I look at the other parts in the context of, so I would say in the journalism world, it's a non, it shouldn't exist, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
not so. But this whole conversation has kind of been like a little bit of overlap in the nonprofit world in journalism. So I can see a little bit of the parts being no problem, but all of a sudden we wake up one day and uh, the sum is greater than the parts.
Yeah.
With the result of AI
Yeah.
and the public, so who is the audience, right? So who is your audience as a nonprofit? And if maybe 5 years ago they wanted to look at their 1099 or sorry their financial statement and kind of see double check legitimacy and kind of see what their track record is, if that was the what everybody used, and now it's people are already getting a little skeptical. I see it as a slippery slope.
Yeah.
I
It is
guess,
tricky.
and as a creative, like nobody wants AI to emulate their stamp, their approach. I mean, that's a massive topic at the moment, especially in right now in the Adobe space, and we spend decades working on a very unique look that separates our work from other people.
Yeah.
That's something that young people aspire to arrive at. You spend, when you're young, you try to emulate your heroes, regardless of what creative industry you're in, right?
Yeah.
You try to mimic some sound on a guitar or some painter, and then eventually you find your own voice and your own stamp, and that when you put your work out there, everybody knows without even looking at the byline who's worked at it. So that's something that we all like aim for, and it is scary,
Yeah.
and I guess I would say that I would hope that the ethics, that the budget doesn't cloud the vision of ethics in terms of the decision makers.
Yeah. I think that's we can hope for that. I think it'll always be a
Yes.
part, right? And that's why. And so, yeah. So to kind of agree to everything, it's going to be a yes and response from me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I think it is a slippery slope. I think when you look at each piece of it, you're like, it's fine. It writes rough drafts for your content or whatever, but like it also speeds up people's ability to put garbage out there. And is the quality of work diminishing? And yes, copywriting your material, like you said, getting a look and feel that then can just be injected into these systems and mass produced as alterations is taking away the intellectual property or the creative, the value of the creativity you made, right? So I think there's copywriting that still needs to come a long ways in figuring out how do you protect artists and individuals in that space, no doubt. I think one industry that we've accepted that's kind of in the middle there is like when people make documentaries, right? Like we know that's not real footage. We know somebody stands in on behalf of whomever, right? If it's an old figure, right? Like we're making a documentary about this person or this subject matter. Somebody is the actor, right?
How about the audio in all of the BBC's massive, huge productions that they do? None of that audio is real.
Right. Right. So
The really close, zoomed in stuff. The footage is amazing, but there's tons of stuff out there about how they generate the audio for that.
yeah, so you can do fake footage, you can do fake audio, you can emulate people's voices with as little as like 10 seconds of audio. So think of David Attenborough, it's like you're not needed anymore. And if your tone
Right.
and the exact like elements of your voice aren't copywritten, then now we can just make anything sound like David Attenborough and we can do fake footage and the animals don't even have to be real, right? Like it is a slippery slope where it's like we didn't actually capture footage of this, and imagine back to like snow leopards. It was like, let's just fake it. Like that is the slippery slope where it's like it's hard to just jump in and not have boundaries. But when we go back to that idea of like this is a crazy event that took place that this organization did something amazing with, like to be able to enhance that story is so powerful. And not to like jump straight to the solution, but what I have liked in a couple conversations I've had is this idea that we just need to be honest around how we're using it, right? Like at the end of a documentary, you're seeing the actor and the real person. You're seeing the facts, right? Like sometimes it's a true story or it's based on a true story, right? We need to start to have that transparency because we can't just shove it under the rug. It's like, oh, that's a photo of that person. Like it's not. So I'm almost thinking we're going to get to a place where, same way we have our DEI policies, like culture has pushed us to a place of saying, like, hey, what are you doing to make the world better? Like, how can you prove to us that you're a company that cares about more than just money? Now we're going to get to a place with this as well, where it's like, what is your AI policy, right? And it's like, yeah, we use it for the following. Like we refuse to use it in the following areas, or we use it, but this is how we use it. We always ground our stories in an actual factual story. And here are the rules we lay down. Like, how do we get the benefits, but protect ourselves from falling into a space where, you know, almost everybody can fake the work they've done, the stories. That's a new space. So we just have to have boundaries around. And I think we're playing with fire, but I think we can tame it. We just have to get on it now around what we all commit to as artists and businesses around how we're going to use that technology in the right way.
Yeah, and I would say that this is the next iteration of the last 30 years. I mean, even longer. I mean, I've taught on this. I've spoken on this before, but there's been a lot of digital, excuse me, film alteration going back as far as, you know, the Spanish Civil War stuff that clear manipulation. So I think it's important to remember that this stuff has kind of always been with us
Yeah.
in the journalism sector. It's been with us in something seemingly as benign as, uh, I mean, when we were kids, you know, the Victoria's Secret catalog would come out, but how much of that was digitally altered, and what was the negative impact that had on like young girls across America? That this is put out as real, but in reality, there's a lot of going on in Photoshop, and
That's true. It's been a slippery slope for a while.
Like a joke, but it's like that's a slippery slope and unintended consequences. So I think the pursuit of authenticity is something that hasn't changed in our culture. It's just looked a little bit different. It's going to look different in a year. It's going to look different in 10. And I think people are going to, our audiences are going to be more, they're going to, how do I say this? You know, they're becoming obviously more savvy, and they were going to maybe have more questions. So I think that's our job. Like that's my job is to convey authenticity in my work, and making it less about, or just being as transparent as possible on your work. And so I guess I'm saying is I agree with what you're saying, but the effort needs to be put forth on the nonprofit side, because it can get, you know, on the journalism side, I hope that it never happens.
I agree.
But on the nonprofit side, I do think that there is a ethical responsibility to move in the direction more of journalism and less in the direction of commercial work.
I think that's a beautiful way to say it. And I think culture it's like you can't put it back in the bag, right? Like I think you mentioned it. I think it's a good truth of like from film to digital was like, well, digital's cheating. It's like too easy. It's like, well, we're still capturing the real stories, but then it's digital to digitally manipulated, right? Now it's digitally manipulated to democratized version of that. And I think of the Instagram filters, and now it's not just a color shift, it's a shift that can tweak and pinch and smooth your skin. And it's like now we have teens that are struggling with depression because you're looking at things that are not reality and it's at a fever pitch. Like it's so much of it, right? Like
Right.
to go get a magazine took time. Now it's like it's you're embedded in it, your face is in it the minute you wake up. If your parents allow it, which they shouldn't. Um, but like young kids they're already in there, and what they're experiencing is an AI version of reality, and that is you cannot keep up with that, right? So that's a challenge. And now
Right.
we're just gonna like that idea of it being a slide, like the slide just got really steep with AI, right? Like it just all of a sudden is something that you
Right.
can just tell it to do a picture of this, tell it to fake this, and you've got back 50 versions you can iterate on. It's just the speed to which creatives can pump that stuff out just got a huge shove. So that's what I think we're dealing with is now we're recognizing how far this idea can go. And I think all we've really done as a culture is recognize it a bit, right? Like, oh, hashtag no filters, right? Like I'm recognizing I'm gonna take pictures, I'm not gonna do any of that manipulation, citing sources. Like we are just behind. But I think we need to catch
Mhm.
up and really recognize like we need to do more to show people when we're faking it that we're faking it, or just to not fake it at all, right? And I think there's also a push for culture to be like, look, that technology's there, and we're not going to use it. We're going to be straight edge against that form of creative expression because it's doesn't have enough value for us. So I think that
Yeah,
that's
and I would say that the nonprofit leaders out there are probably going to find themselves having these discussions in board meetings and realizing, at least my hope, that they're going to need to double down on this. Something that maybe was kind of in the background that was maybe obvious. Now they're going to realize that they are, I would say, at the front of in terms of carrying that responsibility forward on behalf of their mission and to their donors and potentially new donors that they're trying to communicate to.
yeah.
This is, again, it's that authenticity.
Yeah, I love that. All right, you wanted to be able to give some tips and insights. I want to leave us a few minutes, and I want to start
Sure.
with we were in college together. We both had the opportunity to chase the passions that we had. I went more design. You went into design and journalism and photography. I'd love to think back to that time period and say, hey, back then, like, what would you tell yourself, that original self, in terms of where you were going, what you were pursuing? Kind of give some advice to young people who are looking to get into what you're doing.
Uh, I knew what I was getting into was going to be competitive. I don't think I realized to the degree. And uh, so you've got to know you really got to know what you're doing with your craft, and everything else needs to be kind of gleaned and learned as you do it. So I've worked with kind of the same writer on multiple projects. He's about 10 years younger than me, and our first project together, the first time we met actually, uh, was in East Africa during the post-election unrest going on there. And I just met him in the field, and he was just out of journalism school. I always use him as an example because he bought a one-way ticket. He graduated, he went, he kind of like figured out where in the world is like relatively like newsworthy, that he can get his foot in the door as a writer, maybe work for a local paper, a local outlet, something that he can just go. So I love that approach. It's just like basically don't overthink it, just go. And the only way to learn this stuff in terms of the field, what you need to learn in the field and to develop contacts on the ground, is you just got to go. So that's something that I feel like I did, but I would say to double and triple down on that. So, uh, yeah, there's a lot. I don't even know where to go with this, but
Well, you're also
I do
teaching
know that.
too, right? Like, so what else are you seeing in the classroom of young people that maybe, um, some of the pitfalls, right? People who are in your class and love photography but can't quite bridge that gap, right? Like, I think you're around it a lot, so I bet there's a lot of knowledge in there in terms of what
Yeah, there
people
is.
need to learn.
So it seems like every 8 years the approach changes radically. So I feel like a lot of what I have to say could be irrelevant. And I would say maybe a 25-year-old who's killing it right now probably would have a lot more to offer than what I have. I would say, like, for myself, like, working in these places, tough places, and then covering, 5 countries during the Arab Spring, 2011, a lot changed. It, the rules changed what it was like to be on the ground.
Mm.
I just would say that everywhere I went I considered that was under reported or undercovered, it was shocking how uh, alone I was on the ground in terms of wow, like you go to 3 countries next door and there's just thousands of creatives, and you go to where I was and I was the only one or maybe one other. And I just would love to see a little bit more risk taking. Again, the only way to do it is to get on the ground and make it happen. I think you got to be really um, insatiably curious. You've got to be well read. You've got to understand what's happening in the world. What are the causalities of behind things? I'm still a massive believer in reading the Wall Street Journal. I'm understanding not just the facts of A and B, but like what happens in the business side of between A and B.
Mm.
So being well read, being interested, being curious, perfecting your craft, developing contacts, and learning how to have multiple irons in the fire. And what I tell a lot of young people is learn how to write a decent email,
Mm.
spell check, basics. There's a lot of basics. And
Yeah.
again, I couldn't have done anything without having like really significant mentors in my life. Folks that were in the industry for a long time that I could go and ask the stupid questions to, the scary questions to, share ideas with them before I would go to the official pitch. So there's probably a lot of things I'm probably taking for granted, being on the spot right now with that question. That's why I think having a mentor is giant. It's just,
Yeah. I would
you've got
back
to have
that.
that in your life.
I'd back that 100%. And to the due diligence of becoming somebody who can, like you said it as email, I would back it up to just professionalism, right? Like if you're going to be on your own and you're not just going to take a job, you're going to need it anywhere. But if you're going to be independent, like you are, like I am, you have to understand financials, you have to understand the books, you have to understand what a business plan looks like, how to focus, how to choose goals, how to set goals, how to spell check. Like you got to put all of that education to use and be pretty strategic and smart, right? And I think that's where a lot
Right.
of people have failed is just you can't pick the most, the biggest priorities for your day, then you're only going to last so long. But if you can recognize the business problems, whether it's a financial problem or a creative problem, like that's big. So it's almost like a business minor. And I think we spent a lot of time in college taking a lot more business classes than I
Yeah.
ever would have wanted to give credit to.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
graduating with a design major and a business minor was like, man, I don't think I could have ever gotten here if I didn't
Yeah.
take those accounting courses, take
Yeah.
a lot of those business courses that got us to where we are. And mentorship is an area I wish I did sooner. So I would double down on that too. I think now I've got some pretty solid mentors that are helping me not make mistakes 15 years in, that had I had them 15 years ago, I just would be so much further along. And I think I always gave myself the excuse of like, who would give me that time? But now that I'm getting to a place where I'm closer to being a mentor than being mentored to or mentee, um, you love doing it, right? And I see you
Yeah.
love doing it too, right? To teach the next group the things you've learned so that they can be better than you. Like, go ask. Like, if you've got people around
Yeah.
you, the worst thing they could say is no. But if you've got some amazing teacher, some amazing person who's been in front of you, I was always so humbled and honored when people were willing to spend the time. I think that's a great thing for people to do.
Yeah. I would say to young people that like my favorite thing now in my life stage is seeing other young people light up, people who are good at what they're doing, that they've got all the right ingredients. Maybe they just don't know how to get access to this organization or whatever, but they're pursuing it. They understand what it takes. They've got the hunger, and to see kind of the light go on with some of them and to see them flourish, to see them get their first byline makes me genuinely way more happy than
Yeah.
anything I could achieve at this moment. So I completely agree. For sure, ask, get out there, do those things. And just to also to say to you, like, it's so much of my world is not about taking pictures. It's the business, right? It's about, it's, yeah, it's all the things that have nothing to do with pushing a button. It's,
All
yeah,
the in between, right?
yeah.
Yeah. All
A
right.
lot of it's not fun, right? I mean,
No, no.
like what percentage of your day, you look past in the last 25 years is the stuff that you love to do,
Yeah. Yeah. There's that phrase like, saying yes isn't saying yes, saying yes is saying no to 100 other things. Like it's those in this, it's a similar example, right? In order to get those freeing creative days, you've got to spend 10 others getting everything set up so that you can spend that
Yep.
day with the headphones on and being creative. Like that's absolutely
Yep.
true.
I love it.
Well,
Well put.
I also want one last give the nonprofits something, right? Some piece of advice, and we got to wrap up. I always try to keep these under an hour. We're a touch over. Any last words for nonprofits, and then we'll give people a way to find you.
Uh, oh man, I did feel like I touched on a lot, and to be honest, it's a bit of a sore subject because, um, I guess I would like to see nonprofit boards, um, in particular in management, maybe boards more, but starting to pass the torch to a younger generation. And with that said, there's a lot that comes underneath that umbrella.
Yeah.
I would say a lot of things underneath that umbrella of what maybe, Gen Xers like ourselves can bring to the table. But so that's one big thing.
Yeah.
It's back to the mentorship thing. It's like bring the next generation up. I know some are, and I would say to really, again, look at your creative potential on the ground of wherever you're working. Look to see where you can develop mentorship from somebody like me to a handful of young folks overseas. Maybe invest the money in, teaching somebody how to fish as opposed to just sending me to do the fishing.
That's good. I like that.
And to develop skill sets on the ground is something that I see as is it's all upside in that model. It's all up.
I love it. All right, Micah, how do people follow you, find you if they want to learn more?
I don't know, the normal stuff.
LinkedIn. Oh, we'll put some links with the video.
Yeah, but I guess my name was somewhat unique enough that it's easy to find.
All right. Micah Albert, appreciate it. Good talking to you as always.
Yeah, likewise.
Thanks for giving
Good
everybody
to
some
see you.
insights, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah.